Patti Banks is here. Patti Banks is a landscape architect dedicated to developing sustainable communities and landscapes. Patti has led major regional efforts for natural resource preservation and the creation of more ecologically sensitive landscape design solutions. Patti received her bachelor's degree in horticulture, landscape architecture from Purdue University, and she leads a firm of 25 landscape architects founded as Patti Banks Associates, now called, is it Vireo? Vireo, okay, with offices in Kansas City and Omaha. And our next, so with Patti, there's another speaker, Brett Spangler. Where's Brett? There's Brett. Brett is also a landscape architect committed to designing, supporting, and sustaining healthy and vibrant places with a particular emphasis on researching appropriate plant selection and installation in all his designs. Brett, of course, is dedicated to advancing urban agriculture in communities around the region, and Brett earned his bachelor's degree in landscape architecture from Kansas State University and has been with Vireo for 14 years. And today, Patti and Brett are going to talk about horticulture in the new millennium and ecologically sound landscaping. Welcome both of you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm Patti, he's Brett. So just to make that really clear, we've worked together for many years, 14 to be exact. I don't know that I could have I learned something today, but many years creating ecological landscapes and bringing that kind of ecosystem approach to everything that we do. I was asked to incorporate the future into what is the future of horticulture. And so I'm going to try to gaze into that crystal ball. I think it's interesting that they asked the person with the most gray hair to talk about the future. I think maybe it ought to be one of the young people in the room. But I'm going to try to do that. Brett is going to give you a little more practical knowledge based on some of his experience with actual projects and implementing some of the things that we have talked about. First, I wanted to share how we come at this, and it is very much from a natural resource perspective. The one on your left is me in the Smoky Mountains, backpacking. I do carry my own stuff. I want you to know that, every bit of it. And the other one is Brett and his wife, Felisa, doing a native planting out at the Discovery Center. So we don't just draw, we do dig, we do like to get dirty, and we practice what we preach on our own time, not just at work. My belief is that we get really, really good at whatever it is we practice, and that the future of horticulture will be very much aligned with whatever it is we practice. And just to get an idea of who's in the room, I wanted to ask, do we have any designers in the room? Great, great. Do we have any installers? Okay. Growers? Woohoo! Maintenance professionals? Great. How about the rest? What are the rest of you? Students. Excellent. Great, great. Well, thank you for being here. In the introduction, it mentioned a little bit about what I've done in the past, but I wanted to share that a little bit more because for me, what I do and what I practice is really about changing the little piece of world within which I live. And I started in consulting in a landscape architectural firm years and years ago. I'm not going to tell you how many, but many. And went to city government to see if I could have an impact there. I worked for 2 small cities in the metropolitan area, each for about 10 years. I was the assistant city administrator, of all things, in Excelsior Springs, Missouri, and in Liberty, Missouri. So trying to have an impact from that public side. Learned one heck of a lot, and it wasn't about plants, let me tell you. But I started my own company. We had our 20th birthday last July. It's been a great ride, just a phenomenal experience. And we do offer the services that you see up on the board. We specialize in natural resource planning. We've done that regionally as well as on the local level. community planning, parks, trail, and greenways, and some of your more classical landscape architecture as well. There is no happenstance about how those interrelate. This was very purposeful on my part because I think all of them arrive at sustainable places for people, for us and our children, and that each of those is important to our future. And to me, that's what the future of horticulture revolves around, making those great places for people. And just to bring that full circle, this is what I practice day to day. This is how I improve my little corner of the world, trying to do these kinds of things. Not world famous, haven't written books, just trying to take care of my little place and help others do it. So in terms of the future, I looked at this in terms of fears and hopes. First, my fears. My biggest fear is that we will mow. I don't know, those of you in the business, how often do you find that your clients, really all the maintenance they want to do is mow? Anybody experience that? Yeah, for sure. We might mow happily, very happy here, but it isn't very interesting. It isn't very fulfilling, and it isn't very ecologically sound. And Brett's going to talk a little bit more about why that isn't so. My fear is that we'll ask trees to grow in some really, really tough places. This is an actual picture of an installation on Main Street in Kansas City. Had anybody seen that? I don't know that it's there anymore, but those holes are 6. They look bigger here. They are 6 by 6 inches. These are little pear trees. I'm sure they were planted just as whips. They survived quite some time, just showing the tenacity of a pear tree, I suppose. But we ask vegetation to do this. No soil. Go on a sidewalk, will you? Over here, this one was great. This is at the other end of Main Street. That's a jackhammer. They were planting a tree. Okay, they needed a jackhammer to prepare the soil. Poor tree. You know, I haven't gone back to visit it. I guess I should. And then finally on the bottom, one of my fears is that our best efforts at planting native landscapes will end up like the picture on the bottom. This is, in fact, a picture of one of our first best management practices for stormwater. We did that probably 15 years ago. We've learned a lot since then. I'd like to say that they don't look like that anymore. But it takes all of us working together, growers, designers, installers, maintenance professionals, to make a difference and to be able to use these materials in an expert fashion. So my hopes. One of my strongest hopes is that we'll take advantage of every little piece of green space that we can to not only improve the beauty of it, but improve the habitat, the stormwater function, make our landscapes work a lot harder, but in a beautiful way. I want to see us, my hope is that I will see us using ecologically based plant communities as the framework for our planting design, that will bring them all into the heart of the city, not just the burbs, not just on wide open green spaces, but in nooks and crannies. Maybe that 6-inch hole out on Main Street could have been filled with something else that would have been beneficial as well, but would have been more in tune there. Another one of my hopes is that we continue to experience the planting of things, especially native things, and that we do it together and in groups and educate one another about their importance and how to take care of them. Because until we experience something, we don't necessarily care about it. The more we experience it, the more we care about it, and the more we're inclined to take care of it. One of my aspirations is that we concentrate more on planting food, even in our ornamental landscapes. and that we are feeding people at the same time that we're making the world beautiful. That we encourage our major corporations to use natives on their sites, many of which are huge. In this particular case, the picture in the middle is Hallmark cards. That's a rain garden that we planted with their environmental group. Actually helped them plant, we didn't just design it, we helped them plant it. Up in the right-hand corner is a really interesting project. It's called Prairie Stone. It's outside of Chicago. And it's one of the most creative uses I've seen of native vegetation in a very formal business park setting that is just tremendously effective. And here they combine, as you notice, they combine both the mowed grass look with the native vegetation in just wonderful, wonderful results. On the bottom right-hand corner, this is a project called 18 Broadway. Have any of you experienced that? That's one we're very, very proud of. We're the landscape architects on this project. And in that one, it is a very hard-working landscape. It combines growing food with managing stormwater with public open space. And this picture here is part of the stormwater management feature of the site, that basically every drop that falls and comes off the street is purified before it enters the stormwater management system, and it's also recirculated through the site to water the gardens that are then feed and supply. I don't know how much food to harvesters do we create there? Tons in a year.
Several hundred tons last year.
Yeah. So very, very cool project. I guess in the bottom line, I would really hope, and I see the future as replacing our traditional water-hungry, chemical-hungry landscapes with plants that repeat and dwell and thrive in the context that is Kansas City, Missouri, if we're working in Kansas City, Missouri, that we're that in tune with what our landscape is to recreate it in even the more formal landscapes that we are designing and building. Brett's going to share some of his thoughts and experience from some of our projects. Not all of it's good, some of it's bad, so you get to see some of the warts too. And then we'll take some questions after that. Be happy to.
Yep. Thank you, Patti. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, I'm going to start by focusing on a little bit. Patti mentioned her fears. So kind of looking at the standard American landscape. We have acres upon acres of mowed and irrigated turf. This turf requires, a multitude of maintenance activities to keep it, green and luscious from March to October. And this turf formula is pretty much applied everywhere. Even at a detention pond with 3-to-1 side slopes, we have turf all the way down to the water. And some poor maintenance personnel has to go out and mow on those slopes. We have drainage ditches completely full of turf. Again, steep slopes. What happens if that bottom gets soggy? You can't get down in there and mow that. And you're having to mow these on a weekly, if not, bi-weekly, if not weekly basis to keep kind of that short, manicured, fescue look that's become kind of prevalent across the landscape. And even our parking lots, our parking islands, we have lots of little disconnected islands of turf. And each one of those has to be mowed on a regular basis, requiring more energy and input. And if we're not putting turf in our parking islands, we might be putting in a sea of mulch with plants spaced far apart so they're never going to touch. This is a great example here. At this point, the mulch was necessary at the beginning of the planting because it helps, conserve water, suppress weeds. But at some point, mulch keeps getting reapplied, and the mulch becomes the landscape feature and not the plants. These plants aren't ever going to grow together and interact. You'll probably see kind of the same exotic plants that have kind of become ubiquitous across the American landscape. The knockout rose, the daylilies. Yes, they provide season-long color, but what value beyond that do they bring? Our low-growing evergreens, our shrub evergreens, that's our form of adding green color and adding winter interest.
Quote, unquote.
And if plants, if they are allowed to grow together, we're trimming them into nice, neat little hedges or little round meatballs in a sea of mulch. And, there's a time and a place and a need to prune shrubs, for safety concerns, help to improve sight lines, if you're wanting to improve the form of a shrub or a tree. But I'm just not really sure of the purpose of having lots of little meatball shrubs in a big sea of mulch. I'm not sure what value that's bringing to our landscape. So these landscapes have lots of things in common. Continuous maintenance requirements. You've got to mow, you've got to trim, you've got to edge, apply water, apply fertilizer. And in my opinion, these lack sort of any memorable aesthetic. They're pretty much static examples that are, kind of in a perpetually, conforming to kind of the whims of maintenance personnel, and kind of people. These landscapes are viewed as neat and tidy, but are these landscapes inspiring people? Do they elicit emotional responses? Are they helping connect people to a place? I mean, you can see this type of landscape, pretty much anywhere across the country. So why does all this matter? Because we're finding that clients are becoming more interested in sustainable landscapes. As Patti mentioned, we're looking to have landscapes that work harder and do more for us. Landscapes aren't there just for decoration or ornamentation. We need them to be functional. We need landscapes to help perform stormwater functions, help stormwater infiltrate back into the ground, help cleanse stormwater. Shade trees provide cooling benefits, help promote air quality. We're looking to provide habitats and diversity. We want to conserve water. We need plants that are more drought tolerant, looking to serve pollinator and insect populations. And of course, also looking to integrate food production into our landscapes. The standard approach of manicured lawn and mulched beds full of exotic plant materials is not going to provide this. And I want to take a moment, I don't want to come across as I'm, demonizing fescue turf lawns, because, here at Luce Park, this nice expansive lawn is entirely appropriate. And I couldn't, envision Luce Park any other way, or the lawn in front of the Nelson. Those are very appropriate places. What we're trying to move towards is just a more thoughtful approach, and where is the time and the place to use fescue, use all kind of those highly maintained landscapes, and where can we kind of interject more native landscapes, more sustainable landscapes. Kind of looking, Patti mentioned, what about some of these leftover spaces? We have our utility easements, just vegetation that gets mowed down, our parkways, the parkways and boulevards, those medians, the drainage ditches, do those have to be turf? Is there a better way? Can we find just a little bit of balance? This is a great photo here from down in Houston, Texas, adjacent to a medical center, taken what would have been a large expanse of turf and interjected very large areas of prairie plantings. It's actually a coordination between the Cancer Institute there and a local prairie conservancy. So now you have a landscape that's easing back the maintenance a little bit, but also providing amenity for that medical campus. So as designers, we have started to address some of these challenges with landscape design, and obviously the utilization of native grass and perennials became more important than ever. The inclusion of these plants have become kind of a desirable and necessary part of landscape design. Native plants, they're obviously adapted and more tolerant of our regional climates. They also help speak to kind of our unique landscape character. These plants also have highly desirable ornamental characteristics to help improve the landscape aesthetic. These plants also benefit our local insect populations and pollinators. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Doug Tallamy, a research professor in Delaware, he's published a book, done lots of research, and his studies have shown that our insect populations here have evolved over thousands of years to eat the native plants, and that's what they need to survive. So using native plants in our landscape also helps benefit those insect populations. And as a result of this, I mean, you've probably come across more native landscapes in our private settings, like this butterfly garden near City Hall in Kansas City, Missouri, or as Patti mentioned, even this rain garden here on Hallmark's corporate campus. And the great thing is the horticulture industry has responded to this use of natives, fantastically. There are more natives available in the market today, and more cultivars of natives with even highly, more desirable ornamental characteristics. Little blue stem, favorite native prairie grass of mine. There is a plethora of new cultivars out there for designers to use. The unfortunate part, or unfortunately, is I can't say that just putting native plants in your landscape is going to equal sustainability. In my experience, there's been some difficulties along the way, and I want to share a couple of those with you. So, picture on the left here, we have a roadway median, and instead of planting it turf, we've got a mix of, you can see native grasses, trees, and shrubs beyond. And the grass you're seeing there is actually a little blue stem. The issue here, the difficulty, is that little blue stem was put into the same setting that we saw some of the earlier photos, into a sea of mulch with irrigation. So essentially asking a native prairie plant that's drought tolerant, asking it to survive in wood chips that's irrigated on a regular basis. And what you've seen here is at one point, what may have been a full bed, that little blue stem is completely declined back.
Is that the finished product? I mean, is that the finished landscape that you're showing?
After a few years.
After a few years,
of
yes.
poor management, yeah.
Yeah.
After it's been overwatered.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so the verdict is natives don't work. All the time.
And the picture on the right, very similar. That's a great new introduction of blue grama. It's called Blonde Ambition. Again, it's a plant that, it's from the dry prairies. And here it's in another mulch bed, getting frequent irrigation. And a plant that's supposed to be very full and robust is kind of looking a little sickly and, looks like it's in a bit of decline. And Patti, where I'm going with all this, and Patti brought the point, is that now we've started to get this perception that natives don't work. Even the best intentions with designs can go awry. And as designers, we've been learning on the fly. As installers and managers have been learning on the fly, trying to adapt to these new plant materials and approaches. And these kind of difficulties have played out right in front of the public. And the issue is from the public eye, this looks like an unsuccessful planting. And if it's not unsuccessful, the natives may be considered a weed patch. I hear that all the time. You tell someone you're going to be planting natives, and the first thing they say to me is, oh, you mean you're putting in a weed patch. So what we're trying to strive towards here is how can we start to overcome some of these difficulties. We know we want to use natives in our designs, but we need to step back and take a look at planting in a more holistic approach. And we need to start assembling plantings that, looking at using plants that all work together, plant communities, as Patti mentioned, and less of putting together a collection of plants that have different requirements. Can we move away from having the azaleas, which require super acidic soil, next to a plant that doesn't have that requirement? So what we're really looking to move towards is, using nature as an inspiration, and specifically naturally occurring plant communities. And when I say that, I don't mean that, you can obviously go out to the prairie, go out, to the woodland, and use those. Those can be sources of inspiration and example. But you can also look at your local weedy patch, which I've got here in a series of photos. And so real quickly, what do you guys notice about the grouping of weeds, the weed community in this photo? Anything catch your eye? Okay, obviously the noxious weeds. Anything else? Yeah, so, yeah, so first thing I see is every inch of bare soil there is covered. Some sort of weed, some sort of plant has interjected itself and is covering that up. And even though it's a little bit chaotic, you know, there is some aesthetic, you could see some of the, you know, nice landscape aesthetic that is starting to kind of, you know, reveal itself here. You have some of the flowering grasses there. There's some color in the background, some seasonal stuff going on, a wide variety of textures and form. And even this up top gives a little bit of, it's a very structural plant. It gives a little bit of structure. So it's, you know, it's just not, you know, going out to the prairie. I mean, you can walk out into your own neighborhood and look at, you know, find that little weed patch, and that can even help, you know, kind of inspire and inform you on how maybe to handle your landscape and kind of move to a more sustainable approach. And what I'm getting at is, you know, is looking at a community of plants. We're looking to combine the best of horticulture and ecology. So kind of the new buzzword is looking at design plant communities. And this is a way to achieve a desirable landscape aesthetic, provide a functional landscape, provide stormwater functions, provide habitat for pollinators, but yet we're not looking to increase the demands on maintenance personnel. You know, we want these landscapes to be beautiful. We want them to help promote an emotional response. You know, we want people to buy in to the landscape and their surroundings. Public acceptance is super critical, and you know, without that, I could argue that if the public doesn't accept these types of native and mixed plantings, then they're not ever going to be truly sustainable. And when I mentioned, you know, looking to the prairie or the woodlands, we're not looking to, you know, go recreate exactly what we see out there. It's more about looking to those settings for inspiration and giving us guidance to how we could create some of these plant communities in our landscapes. And there's lots of designers out there today that have been doing this for several years. Some of their names may be familiar to you. Pete Aldolf, Nigel Dunnett, Roy Diblick, just to name a few. Even a landscape architecture professor down at the University of Texas in Arlington is doing research studies on how plant communities could be integrated into our landscape. And there's actually a new book out by landscape architect Thomas Rayner and landscape designer Claudia West, and they really distill down kind of 5 principles and how to approach designing these types of communities. And I want to share these real briefly with you. So the first one, if you look at that picture in the upper left corner, you know, we're looking about combining plants that have similar requirements and needs. And looking to use plants that will cover the ground, plants that will rise up and flower and provide some seasonal themes, plants that may be a little more structure oriented, and other kind of filler type plants that are kind of weave their way in and fill in the gaps. And that picture there is kind of a good example of the type of planning that we're looking at. The second thing will be to kind of take what the site gives you. If your site has clay soil, that doesn't mean you have to run out and amend it. Instead of, you know, dumping time and money into fertilizer, you know, we can look at specifying plants that tolerate and like clay soil. The other thing to look at or to consider, one of the principles, is that you need a strong ground plane of plants to cover the ground and help push back and control weeds. So instead of hardwood mulch, the concept here is using green mulch. So we're using plants like the sedges here, the grassy-looking plants. Other plants such as epimedium. It's not a native, but it's a great ground cover that loves dry shade. And the benefit of this would be over time, you're not having to reapply mulch in the landscape. The plants are kind of doing the hard work for you and helping control weed populations. Another important part is that when designing these communities, they need to be legible and have kind of definitive edges and still provide kind of that clean look. And there's several ways you can do that. The image that Patti showed earlier, that nice kind of mowed fescue edge up against a massing of prairie plantings gives that intentional, very purposeful look. The pictures above that are both from Olympic Park in London, one during the summer, one during the fall, and early winter. And you can see the designer there has used some nice linear forms of upright ornamental grasses, and there's even a boxwood hedge in there, just to give it a little extra structure and purpose. So when the public views that, they can read that as a truly intentional planting. So the next principle would be the management of the communities, and I say management, not maintenance. You're not looking to provide, specific activities for one plant. What we're talking about is you're making decisions that will be applied across the entire community. You're not going out and providing a little extra water for one plant and a little fertilizer for another plant. Management decisions are made across the entire community. And kind of the last thing would be looking to provide seasonal interest. Of course, when you're combining lots of different mixed perennials and grasses, you start to achieve that aesthetic. But I think a lot of designers forget about using bulbs, especially in the spring, or the spring bulbs, the value they can bring to the landscape. The upper right corner there, even at the end of a winter season, late February, early March, the native landscapes can look a little bit tired. Some of that color gets bleached out, and the crocus poking up through the ground provides nice bursts of color, and again, help signify that as a little more of an intentional landscape with lots of good seasonal interest. So using this designed plant community approach, what kind of impacts could this have on the landscape and horticulture industry? First of all, I think, and Patti's already mentioned this, there's going to be more collaboration among the partners. Designers, installers, management are all going to need to work together and help increase their knowledge and inform each other of any unique knowledge they may have. Particularly for designers, it can't be anymore where we do the design, hand it off, the installer puts it in the ground, and we're not there to help oversee. There's got to be more collaboration there. And then the designer working with maintenance personnel to help understand the intent and desired goals. I think these designs are going to going to require a broader use of plants, and this provide an opportunity for the horticulture industry to supply plants that maybe normally haven't been utilized enough or been undervalued in the past. I think sedges are one of those plants. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Carex genus, but there's pretty much a sedge for almost every condition. Dry shade, full sun, wet. They're a fantastic group of plants. I think will be a especially important group of plants when it comes to helping provide kind of the ground cover level for some of these design communities. And there's going to need to be more sensitivity to the plant's needs, especially to get these landscapes established properly. We want more emphasis and attention on the optimal planting times. One of the things you can run into on construction jobs is, on new construction jobs, is you're kind of on the construction schedule. So what that leads to is that the job's got to be done September 15th. So we're getting a call asking if it's okay to go ahead and put plants in, mid-July in the heat of the summer. And that is not optimal, and that can lead to future problems down the line.
Any of you have that issue? Yeah, absolutely. It's not sheetrock, is it?
That too. And then another thing with maintenance, there's not going to be a set of prescribed activities, kind of with your regular, manicure turf. There's going to be more observation and understanding. Walking through, checking the landscape, and seeing what's going on. Is there a bare spot? What does that mean? Is there a dead plant or a plant that's looking sickly? It doesn't mean you have to immediately start watering it or fertilizing it. Start to do a little bit of problem solving. So knowledge is going to be critical, and I think helping to train designers and installers and maintenance people to kind of be apprised of this will be important to kind of help for these communities to achieve kind of the ultimate success. I'll share just a few quick examples. Some of these may be familiar to you. Kind of the ultimate expression of these design plant communities would be the Leary Garden at Millennium Park in Chicago and the High Line in New York City. Very public, kind of very well-known spaces now. Both of these designed by Pete Aldolf. But I mean, you can start to see the potential of when you start to design with these communities, and just the amount of aesthetic pleasure that can be derived year-round with this type of planting. And the great thing about with the High Line is the public is really bought into that. It's kind of a nice treasure for the city of New York. There's even a group that's been formed, Friends of the High Line, and they help organize volunteer efforts to go out and perform management activities. They have horticultural advisors on hand to help some of those volunteers that may not be always well-versed in plants. Just another public setting here. This is a new deck park in Dallas. Again, integrating a nice mix of drought-tolerant native grasses and perennials. And not just the public spaces. We've got corporations looking to help improve their landscapes too. The picture on the left here is in downtown Oklahoma City. This is the corporate headquarters for Sandridge Energy. Very urban setting, and you can see they've taken a nice kind of sloped, mounded landscape form, and instead of putting it to turf, they've used a nice little combination of just 2 or 3 plant materials. That's the great thing. It doesn't have to be, a community doesn't have to be, 15 to 20 different types of plants. Even just a simple mix of 2 to 3 can really provide what you need. And in this case, helping hold that slope and providing year-round seasonal interest, color, and a texture. And again, going back to the Hallmark Rain Garden here, Hallmark on their campus, find that lowest spot in the fescue, kind of their fescue lawn area where all the drainage goes to, dug that out, planted it all with natives, and that upper picture is right after it's planted, and you can kind of see the results at the bottom there. A nice kind of full landscape that's really providing kind of value and a little more bold aesthetic to Hallmark's campus. And Patty's mentioned 18 Broadway in downtown Kansas City. This landscape was once just kind of an empty city block, not much going on there. It's been kind of transformed into a vibrant landscape community for both people living and working in downtown, for the big sweeps of native grasses, the slopes planted with natives. You walk around this site during the summer, I mean, the birds are just everywhere, insects everywhere buzzing around. And this mix of native grasses and wildflowers providing fantastic seasonal interest. The pictures on the left, just great fall color. And then on the right, the summer blooms. And then all that that native landscape kind of helps frame some of the terraces in the space where there's urban agriculture going on. And the last thing I want to share with you here, we've talked about public acceptance. It's really critical. Quick little local example. So the image on the right is Prairie Star Parkway over in Lenexa. And that image is probably a couple years old.
Oh, at least, yeah.
But as many of you may know, there's a current mix of fescue turf on the edges, and then there's a nice kind of curving border or curving mass of native grasses, a mix of native grasses that kind of wind its way through the parkway. But way back in the beginning, when those native grasses were originally seeded, they were put down in the ground with an addition of annual poppies to kind of help provide a little extra burst of color before the native seed could establish. And what ended up happening is the native seed did not take that well. The poppies came up, had kind of a glorious explosion of blooms, very similar to the image you're seeing on the right.
Anybody remember that? It was many years ago.
And the residents in the area, people that drove that on their way to their commute to work, became quite attached to that. That kind of colorful flower explosion was really something unique, in their daily commute, which otherwise, other parts of that commute might just be driving along fescue turf. But one of the difficulties that came up was right beneath those flowering poppies was a nice massing of thistle that was getting ready to bloom.
Solid thistle. Nothing else.
Nothing else. None of the native grasses. So the city had to come out and basically mow down the poppies and the thistles. And this angered some residents. And there were lots of calls to City Hall asking what happened to the poppies. And I bring this up because people became invested in that landscape. It was something, something beautiful, something unique, something special. And people started to care about it. And that's ultimately kind of what we're working towards, is to have some of these landscapes that, beyond manicured turf, beyond the pruned hedge, how can we interject some of this beauty into just our normal, typical landscapes? And with that, I mentioned a few designers and researchers, and I just wanted to put this up here. This is some reading material, fantastic resources, very inspirational if you read these books. And some of you may have already be familiar with them, but if you're not, I would seek them out. I found them very helpful. And with that, I think we'll take questions.
Yes?
I'm from St. Louis, and it seems like what would happen is how companies come and go, and the original company had this beautiful landscaping put in, and then they moved, and then the people that came and bought it, it's like they, I guess, thought it was going to take care of itself, and it's like, and it ends up being a mess, and it's like with native plants and things.
Mm-hmm.
So then the public gets this wrong impression of what's really going on in the landscape, and the company not realizing that this is, to me, a part of their image.
Absolutely.
Like
Absolutely.
you saw it when you were driving by the highway, it was just right there, this landscape that once was beautiful and not, and they never improved it, but it was as if they didn't feel it was part of their building.
Well, I like to be generous in that. It just isn't, they do a great mechanical inspection, and they understand exactly how that building works and how all those systems work. They do a great parking inventory to understand that they have enough spaces for all of their employees and their visitors and everything else. But landscape is sort of down on the list, and the idea is to cut the cost of taking care of that, if at all possible. And that's what gets us back to the picture of, are we just going to mow? And I think it's the responsibility of all of us to make sure that doesn't happen to us, to make sure that we're richer than that.
Do you have any ideas for how to start training the maintenance people? I think that, for me, is the enormous problem when you put in native plantings, is that the person comes in, designs and or installs it, and then the person who's taking care of it says, oh, let's mow it. There's
Yeah.
Beautiful rain garden was put in near our price chopper out in Raymore, and right now it's mowed.
Yeah.
Like the turf that's around it.
Happens all the time.
Nobody
Nobody understood it or knew what it was. There have been ideas for certification of maintenance professionals in native landscapes. And the Extension Office, it was probably 5 years ago, was developing a course for that. But I think your Extension Office is a great resource for getting maintenance people trained. One thing you have to understand, though, is those people change. It is a challenge. You have a new set of people every, I don't know, February, March? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Don't even speak the same language. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think more practice, as I said in the beginning, the more we practice, the better we'll get at it. We're not there yet. Yes.
Most of the things that you had shown us were big expanses of native landscapes. We deal a lot with small homeowners that have smaller yards and really trying to help them figure out what are some of their key plants to be able to put into a small area that, as some referred to before, doesn't just look like a weed patch in there.
Yeah, that
And they're small little suburban.
that first book, The No Maintenance, that is perfect for that application. And in that, he suggests different plant communities for a variety of circumstances. Great, great resource.
We see a lot of people who will come get them and their neighbors, you're not mowing, you're not,
Yeah.
because it's not enough, they don't have enough area in that to really get that big statement.
Another thing that,
Some of your designs that you have done, have you worked with that?
oh, absolutely. One thing we've learned, and it was illustrated earlier, is it has to have an edge. We have to have a sense of order. It's just human beings. If it gets too wild and crazy, we can't stand it. We think a fox is going to come and take our child or something. And I heard that. That is a true statement. So it has to have a defined edge. It almost doesn't matter what's behind the edge. Any of you gardeners? Okay, I got great big gardens myself. I don't have time to do what needs to be done. But I have a nice edge. And it always looks pretty darn good, despite what's behind that edge. Was there a question here?
Is it hard to design something that the customers expect?
Well, it's not hard to design what the customer expects. It's hard to design within their budget. Because their budget is this big, and their expectations are this big. And we work a lot for general contractors who have, over the years, computerized their estimating process. Part of that computerization is they only need X percent, little tiny percent, for landscape. We're supposed to fit that, despite the owner's aspiration of being Hallmark cards or Prairie Stone or meeting even city regulations for stormwater best management practices. It's a real challenge. I've done sessions with J.E. Dunn's estimators to try to get them to understand that what they've been using is simply turf and maybe irrigation, that they get to give that number to the owner first, which is huge. We don't. The owner thinks that is all it should cost him. So we become the financial problem. We're a little tiny part of the budget, but we become the financial problem every day, every day.
Do you go back in and take out the irrigation system when you put in some of these gardens, or how do you deal with that?
It depends.
Well, part of it is, trying to look at, you shot the photo up there. Drip irrigation and a lot of our drought-tolerant perennials and native stuff they don't play well together. So if an owner or client is requesting irrigation, we're really looking at going back to spray irrigation. but letting them know, you're paying to put that in, and after a couple of years, you may not have to use that. And an important part of that is following up and making sure that, that those beds that have the irrigation aren't on the same schedule as the turf next to it.
Zoning is important.
Yep.
And turning it off. The observation that Brett mentioned, learning to observe. The plant will tell you when it's not happy. You just got to look. Here.
Our experience has been that you do have to really educate the clients on that there are certain types of clients that just cannot help themselves with the irrigation. That would be golf courses. They just don't get it. So at one golf course, we just cut them off.
Yeah.
We just cut off the irrigation
Wow.
in that area because no matter how much we told them, they over-irrigated. So finally we just said, no, let's turn it off.
Put a valve there.
Well, and the other thing is, those plants, they get too much water, they start to take on that floppy appearance. And then you're kind of perpetuating that, the weedy perception of natives.
In the back?
Aren't these native prairie grasses, perennial gardens, won't those be like a lot more expensive and wouldn't they take a lot longer to get established?
Well,
When you look at them, there's so many plants in it. I mean, that, to me, it seems like, I love them, but it seems like they would be so expensive because there's so many plants in there.
one thing, Brett, why don't you talk about the idea of the different size plants?
Yeah, I didn't
because
mention that.
everything doesn't have to be done in the same way, and so
So when
keep
you're
costs down.
looking at, installing more of a plant community, those ground cover type plants that are going to kind of help cover all that bare ground, those could go in as very small plants, but plugs. And those are much, much more affordable than a 4-inch pot, a gallon-sized container. You may want to look at, some of your grasses and some of your more structural plants, like something like an indigo, that takes a little while to establish. You may want to put that in as a larger size plant so it takes off and is establishes quicker as part of the landscape. And then, mixing in, some of that other filler material, filler plants could be, seed that gets broadcasted on afterwards. So it's
So use
about
all of that.
using all sizes, kind of all methods to kind of achieve the aesthetic, but still kind of, balance the budget and the costs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You have to know, yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure, sure. Sure you could. But when we're doing a project, we're required to get it all done, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you were looking to, tear out a portion of fescue on a budget and you want to start somewhere, it'd be looking at, what kind of matrix of those ground cover plants could you put in to start to cover that soil. And as those fill in, maybe next year you start to put in some more of like your seasonal theme plants that start to add some color, or some other upright plants to give a little bit of structure. You can definitely layer it over time.
Back to the price of natives, there are lots of great resources anymore to get
Mm-hmm.
plants. And if you're talking about plugs, which he was, here, they're $2.50, $2.75 or something. And granted, you may need more of them, but if you space them correctly, they'll fill in. I don't think they're any more expensive, even if
Right.
you get into bigger plants. Missouri wildflower, Horticultural in St. Louis.
Yep.
There's just a lot of resources, and Prairie Nursery up in Minnesota. Those folks all know what they're doing.
Absolutely.
They have to proceed. So stay with them, because you'll find that once the stuff lasts, it will make it.
Yeah, it does take a little longer to establish, and which relates to irrigation. Sometimes you need to irrigate it at first, just so it gets water, but turn it off. I mean, and that's one of our struggles, is often we're gone as soon as the project is finished, and it's handed over. We do maintenance manuals, but people don't read. So, we try to go visit, but we can't take care of everything we do. But we've been known to pull the weeds in 18 Broadway because we're so proud of that project. But we can't do them all. But that handover to maintenance is an issue, and because it does change so much and so often. Yes?
You mentioned earlier that the idea is basically to make your landscapes work harder, but in a beautiful way. And I'm sort of wondering, like on a related note, to what degree do you incorporate biotechnology into the work that you do? Is that something that you're familiar with? Because I know Brett, I believe, you said he graduated from K State,
Mm-hmm.
and I actually first heard about biotechnology there at a conference.
Yeah, not too familiar with that actually.
Not me.
No.
Nope.
I've only heard about it in relation to landscape architecture, which is why I thought I would ask. But it's basically this idea that you're using specific plants in urban areas in order to suck out all of the.
Oh,
I'm sorry,
yeah, sure.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize the term, but absolutely, we do that.
That term again, please.
It's phytoremediation.
Remediation.
Yes, it's remedying the sites using plants. That's different though.
That's a little different, yeah.
Yeah, there's bioremediation, there's phytoremediation. It's a little bit different.
Great. We've experimented with that a lot in stormwater management because there we're not just talking about the quantity of water, we're talking about the quality of the water. And certain plants are more beneficial in treating certain effluent than others. And yes, we do that. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We're on time today. So big round of applause to all of you for being here. Next year we'll have another day, another theme. So hope you'll come back. A big round of applause to the audio video people. They have been here since morning. Thank you. Jason Brunken, who is not here, but he was helping us. Thank you to him. And of course, Access Services, my students, Stephen Young, our greenhouse manager, to all of you. Thank you. Okay? Thank you.